I've worked the late shift at Hannigan's Grocery for nearly 2 years. Most nights are uneventful, stocking shelves, scanning items, and listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights above me. It's routine, monotonous even. But that night was different. The store was dead quiet. It was near closing, the kind of quiet where every little sound feels amplified. The refrigerator in the back hummed its usual tune, and the automatic doors would occasionally let out a soft whir, though no one entered. My co-workers had already clocked out. I was the only one left, or at least I thought so. I was at the register, scanning through inventory on the screen, trying to pass the time when I noticed something. A shadow at the far end of aisle 4. It was subtle at first, barely more than a flicker in the corner of my eye. I brushed it off, convinced it was just the lights playing tricks on me. I looked down, focusing on the screen again, but then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a figure, motionless at the end of the aisle. I turned my head sharply, trying to get a better look, but all I could see was a silhouette, standing there, as if watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, hoping to make out some details, but the figure was shrouded in shadows, no face, no movement, just standing there, like a dark stain against the brightly colored cereal boxes lining the shelves. "Hello?" My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. No response. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light, a leftover customer browsing for a last-minute item. Still, my gut twisted in a way that made me uncomfortable. I leaned over the counter to get a better look, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there. Then, without a sound, it glided down the aisle and out of sight. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I was alone. There were no customers left in the store. I had checked, but that thing, whatever it was, it moved like it had a purpose. Instinct kicked in. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a broom behind the counter. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My legs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by some invisible force, but I forced myself to move. I walked toward aisle 4, every step echoing through the empty store. The silence was suffocating. I peered around the corner, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the aisle was empty. The shelves stood silent, undisturbed, no shadow, no figure. I turned down each aisle, one by one, scanning for any sign of movement, but the store was as still as a tomb. My palms were slick with sweat, and the broom handle felt like dead weight in my grip. I kept moving, my eyes darting from corner to corner, waiting for something, anything to jump out. But there was nothing. I circled back to the register, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. That's all it was, fatigue from too many late shifts in a row. Yet, as I returned to my post, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking just out of sight. The rest of my shift crawled by in agonizing silence. Every creak, every flicker of the overhead lights sent a jolt through my body. I tried to focus on the register, on counting the till, on anything that would keep my mind off the shadowy figure. But the uneasy feeling clung to me like a second skin. When my relief finally arrived, I was out the door before I could even clock out properly. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the eyes watching me, the cold presence lingering just behind. For the next few weeks, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after that night. I told myself it had been my imagination, a hallucination born from exhaustion and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until the 3rd week that I saw her again. I was in the store, not working this time, just picking up some essentials after hours. The place was busier than usual, filled with late-night shoppers grabbing groceries. But there, down the same aisle, standing still as a statue, was the shadow. My blood ran cold. I blinked, hoping she'd vanish like before, but this time she didn't. She stood there, unmoving, as the other customers walked past her like she wasn't even there. I took a step closer, heart pounding in my chest. My feet felt like lead, but I had to know. I had to see her up close. But when I rounded the corner, nothing. The aisle was empty again. It's been months since that night, and I've tried to forget, to pretend it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that she's still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to notice her again. Now, every time I walk through those aisles late at night, I feel it, that cold, creeping sensation that something is watching, something that I wasn't supposed to see. It started like any other Saturday, a quick trip to the supermarket to grab a few things before the weekend really kicked off. The parking lot was packed, and I squeezed into a spot near the back, barely avoiding a collision with a cart someone had carelessly left in the middle of the lane. Inside, the noise hit me like a wall. Shoppers milling about, the hum of conversation, the sharp beeps of registers. I grabbed a cart and pushed through the crowd. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was in a hurry, moving from aisle to aisle, dodging people who seemed determined to block every narrow passage. I didn't pay much attention to the faces around me. Why would I? Just strangers. But then, while reaching for a box of cereal, I felt it, that uncomfortable sensation of being watched. It was subtle, just a prickling on the back of my neck. I glanced around, and that's when I saw him. He wasn't close, maybe 20 feet away. A man, dressed in a nondescript gray jacket with a baseball cap pulled low. His face was mostly obscured, but I caught a glimpse of his eyes, cold and fixed right on me. I turned away quickly, pretending I hadn't noticed, but my mind raced. It could have been nothing, just a guy zoning out in the middle of a busy store. I told myself not to be paranoid. But as I continued shopping, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I moved to a new aisle, I'd spot him out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes he was browsing a shelf. Other times he was just standing there, seemingly waiting for something, and every time his eyes were locked on me. I sped up, my heart starting to pound in my chest. This is ridiculous, I thought. It's just a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But then, in the frozen food section, I made a sharp turn and nearly collided with him. He didn't flinch, didn't step back. He just stood there, watching me. His gaze wasn't normal. It was piercing, calculating, like he was sizing me up. His lips twitched into the faintest smile, and my stomach dropped. I muttered an apology and turned my cart around, trying to keep calm. But something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't some random encounter. This man was following me. I hurried through the next few aisles, practically throwing items into my cart, my skin crawling. I couldn't escape the sensation of his eyes on me. He never approached, never said a word. He just stayed in the shadows, always just out of reach. By the time I reached the checkout, I was sweating. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the aisles. But I didn't see him. For a moment I thought maybe it was over, that he'd moved on. But as I paid for my groceries and turned to leave, there he was, standing at the end of the aisle, half hidden in the shadows, watching me. I bolted for the exit, practically running with my bags. The automatic doors slid open, and I stumbled out into the bright afternoon light, gasping for air. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my car keys, the feeling of his gaze burning into my back. I didn't look behind me. I didn't want to see him standing there. I threw the bags into the trunk, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped out of the parking lot. My heart was still racing as I merged onto the highway. It's over, I told myself. He's just some creep. He's not going to follow you home. But I couldn't stop checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his car tailing mine. And then I did see him. He wasn't in a car. He was standing on the sidewalk as I pulled away, just watching. His face was obscured by the brim of his cap, but I could feel his smile, cold and predatory, as if he knew something I didn't. I couldn't shake the image of those dead, emotionless eyes. For days after, I kept expecting him to appear, at work, outside my apartment, in the parking lot of some random store. But he didn't. It was like he'd vanished. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time I went out, I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the crowds for his face. It was irrational, but I couldn't help it. And then came the phone calls, anonymous, silent, just static on the other end. I'd hang up, my heart racing, convinced it was him. The police said they couldn't do much without more proof, without any real threat. Maybe it's just a prank, they said, but I knew. He was still out there, watching, waiting. I never saw him again, not in person. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with that same feeling I had in the supermarket, that creeping dread, that cold sensation of being observed. I lie there, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know. He's still out there, and one day he'll find me again. I never believed in ghosts. They were the stuff of campfire stories, of late-night television specials that people watched for a thrill. But I manage a grocery store, not some haunted mansion. That's where I've spent the last 15 years, pouring my sweat into every creaky floorboard, every stocked shelf. The aisles, the flickering fluorescents, even the stale smell of produce past its prime. It all became part of my routine. Safe, predictable. Until last month, when everything changed. It started small, subtle, a light in aisle 7 that kept flickering. At first I brushed it off. It's an old store, after all, but then it seemed like the flickering followed me. I'd walk past, and, zap, it would blink out, stand still, and the light would settle, only to flicker again when I turned my back. I thought I was overworked, losing it from all the long nights alone, balancing inventory. But things escalated. I'd spend an hour organizing an aisle, only to return the next day and find the shelves completely rearranged. Products I knew I'd stocked would move back to their old places, like they had a mind of their own. Then came the perfume, sickly sweet, the kind of smell you imagine a woman from another time wearing, thick enough to make you gag. At first I thought someone had spilled a bottle in the aisle, but the scent was always there. Not in one spot, either. It followed me, like a cloying shadow, always just behind me, no matter where I went in the store. It wasn't until that Thursday night, just past midnight, that I realized something was terribly wrong. I was closing up, making my usual rounds, when I heard it. A whisper. I stopped in my tracks, thinking it was just the old building creaking in the cool night air. But it wasn't. This whisper was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention, soft, raspy, coming from the back of the store near the stockroom. My blood froze in my veins, but I convinced myself it was nothing. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, gripping a can of soup from a nearby shelf, as if that would do anything. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. My legs felt like lead as I forced myself toward the sound, the dim lights flickering in sync with my heartbeat. As I approached the stockroom door, I felt it, a shift in the air, a cold that seeped into my bones. The scent of that God-forsaken perfume was stronger here, sickeningly thick. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I gripped the handle, My mind screamed at me to run, but something, curiosity maybe, kept me moving. I flung open the door. Nothing. No one was there. Just the rows of stacked boxes and shelves. I let out a shaky breath, my nerves frayed. But then I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, a single can of peaches sat teetering on the edge of the shelf. Before I could react, it toppled to the floor with a deafening clang. I jumped back, my heart slamming in my chest. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the dim reach of the light. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch too far. Its form wasn't solid either, more like smoke, shifting and curling. But its presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat as I raised the soup can like some pathetic shield. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice trembling. No response, just the whispering, louder now, and more guttural. The figure stepped forward. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a blur of shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold and relentless, boring into me. I took a step back, then another. The figure followed, slow and deliberate, the whispering now a growl that reverberated in my chest. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It moved like it was gliding, closing the distance between us with every second. Panic took over. I bolted, sprinting down the aisle, my feet barely keeping up with my racing heart. The whispering echoed behind me, growing louder and louder, until it felt like the whole store was alive with the sound. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I crashed through the emergency exit, the alarm blaring as I stumbled into the cold night. My lungs burned, my body shaking with adrenaline. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys as the image of that shadowy figure burned into my mind. I sped off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't get the sound out of my head. The whispering, the growl, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I didn't go back to the store the next day, or the day after that. I told myself I needed time, needed space, to clear my head. But the truth was, I was terrified. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, what I'd felt. And that was the worst part. I heard from my assistant that things have only gotten stranger since I left. Lights flicker constantly now. Products keep moving on their own. And customers, some of them have started complaining about a smell. Sweet, sickly perfume. Every night I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by that whisper, by the figure in the shadows. I know I should go back, confront whatever it is, but I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting for me.